I just want to say that this paper in particular is part of a bigger project which looks at the literary and cultural reconfigurations of underworld Mumbai and Naples in contemporary literary texts, films and documentaries. So, but today I'm just going to concentrate on Naples. Naples and the ways of theorizing and thinking about urban space through criminality, rather than thinking about criminality as a tool of cultural objectification normally associated with Naples or the South in general. So I just want to say that, okay, cultural representations of Naples have been mediated by the popular perception of the city as a crime-ridden place, an infected appendix in the south of Italy. This is how Salviano refers to Naples, an infected appendix in the south of Italy, and Camorra. So this idea has entrenched itself in the collective imaginary of the country over the past 2 centuries since Italian unification. So, drawing on John Comer's argument that criminality constitutes a vehicle to think about the nightmares that threaten a nation, this paper posits the problem of Naples as a paradigmatic example of processes of othering and racialization across the global South. So, and I try to give a post-colonial perspective on Naples through the lens of criminality. And the way I use the term post-colonial rests on 2 main implications. First, it is based on geographical situateness, and I'm going to explain this in a second, in terms of Naples as a location which exemplifies a particular or a peculiar Mediterranean way of thinking, and I'm going to go into that in a second. But it also refers to the process of internal colonization that Naples was subjected to after Italian unification. And I'm going to think about post-colonial Naples through these 2 aspects, especially through the lenses of, well, the lens of criminal organizations. So, appropriating the subaltern's language to provide an outlet of hope for the poor sectors of the population, while simultaneously acting in concurrence with the state, criminal organizations generate a number of overlooked zones of ambiguity within the city. So by going beyond the accommodational space negotiated by the oppressor and the resistor, Naples can be regarded as a vital arena of cultural signification to investigate the hidden connections between the underworld and conventional power structures that both disrupt and reinforce the teleological project of modernization and state relations. So Naples problematizes traditional understandings of post-colonial world cities, as criminality offers a view of the urban environment that does not fit within specific spatial dyads of power or spatial binaries, or specific spatial binaries, and I'm going to explain this in a second as well. I just want to think about the so-called problem of Naples in relation to criminality and just go through this quickly before I present you with a close reading of a text which helps us to theorize and think about the disjunctures created by criminal organizations in post-colonial world cities. So the so-called problem of Naples emerged in an ostensibly more defined pattern in the years preceding and following Italian unification. It was based on the assumption that the city's corruption depended on the inhabitants' tendency to deploy, and this is a quote, an Arabic exercise of violence. So this was a way of thinking about Naples, which, well, actually, this was a phrase which was used by the Italian criminologist Niceforo, who wrote in 1898 L'Italia Barbara Contemporanea. And referring to the backwardness of the south of Italy, Niceforo invoked the magical powers of statistical evidence to demonstrate that criminality in Naples could be ascribed to a distorted generic pattern that linked its inhabitants to the exotic Arabs. So, post-unification hegemonic narratives connected Naples' geographical proximity to the southern Mediterranean regions imposing the cultural and imaginary templates associated with a state of lawlessness typical of colonial and post-colonial societies. So, as a crossroads of several global cultural and economic intersections, Naples sits, as Ian has pointed out in one of his pieces, in a space that extends both from Southern Europe and from North Africa. So the city's oriental character, physically visible in its landmarks, refers to a long history of cultural interchanges with the Arabs of the Islamic Emirate of Sicily from the 9th century onwards. So Naples' geographical proximity to and cultural affinity with the southern Mediterranean regions alimented the fervid imagination of a number of visitors who regarded the city as a symbol of the barbaric south. For example, Augustin de Chrysalis, who was a Napoleonic official, wrote in a letter, "Europe ends in Naples, and ends quite badly. Calabria, Sicily, all the rest is back to Africa." So, throughout the 19th century, this widespread cultural imaginary was reinforced by the resentment of a number of liberal intellectuals who opposed the absolutist regime of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, with its capitals in Naples. And one of these was La Farina, for example, who wrote that the corruption emerging in Naples could lead to the gangrene of the rest of the state. There's also another Neapolitan intellectual, which you mentioned in your talk as well, Pasquale Villari, who in his Southern letters especially refers to a specific letter on the Camorra, in which he connected the miserable state of the Neapolitan masses with the development of criminality. And so he says, basically, the Camorra is a logical, natural, necessary consequence of a certain social condition. So in his writings, the city itself becomes synecdoche with the widespread poverty and barbarism of the Neapolitan population. And we've got a quote from one of these southern letters. So these slums generally have an entryway without any opening onto the street, and a little courtyard, both utterly filthy, which open onto an immense quantity of terrible dwellings, much worse than kennels, in fact. In these slums, several thousand people live piled on top of one another, so degraded by misery that they seem more brutes than men. So the poverty of Naples is connected to this notion of criminality as well. In a way, Villari's argument was that some sectors of the Italian population were forced, or some people were forced to become criminals because of poverty. So, framing cultural objectifications of underworld Naples in the context of the city's Mediterranean legacy, I employ the term post-colonial to foreground a critique of the city filtered through the lens of a misconstrued Mediterranean heritage, conventionally associated with an Arabic exercise of violence, just to use Nicephorus' qualification. But as I said at the beginning of this talk, my use of the term rests on the historical and geographical situateness of Naples, A, as a city, exemplary of dynamics of internal colonization, and B, as a location that in Franco Cassano's terms defies what he calls the fundamentalism of land and sea, which is typical of a Mediterranean way of thinking. I'm just going to explain this in a second. So, the relationship, basically, Franco Cassano in Southern Thought doesn't talk about Naples in particular, but he talks about this Mediterranean way of thinking and the relationship between the structural or homology of Greece and its culture. So, he says basically the relationship between the structural homology of Naples and its culture retraces the contours, he says, of Greek philosophy. The balance between the liquid expanse of the sea and the borders of the land means Greek thought invites openness, intersections, and refuses to be compared against the kind of closure typical of Occidentalism. So Cassano reclaims the Mediterranean as a cultural template, offering Europe a new vision deriving from the polytheism of thought. So as he explains, Greece as a country exists, got the quote, on the borderland and internalizes it. A land incapable of closing itself off, a society open and off borders, a fluid city, doomed to experience and contain within itself relationship and conflict. A great land, precisely because it is a minor coastal land, far away from the solipsism of continents. So what I want to say, why am I saying all these things? I want to just build on this analogy of Greece and say that the structural homology of Naples as a land incapable of closing itself off is mirrored in a ambiguous position that the Camorra occupies within the city, the wider state and the economy. So, situated in a specific context, criminal organizations foreground the grey areas in the city that cannot be categorized within traditional spatial diads of power because of the role they play as forces operating both within and outside formally constituted authorities. So they provide a close-up of Naples that exemplifies the slippage between signifiers and signified, which defies what Cassano referred to as the lack of fundamentalism of land and sea, which characterizes Mediterranean locations. So, one way to visualize the ambiguous areas generated in the city by the activities of criminal organizations will be to equate them to black holes. Okay, according to Caleb Schaff, a black hole represents a curvature of space-time in which matter has collapsed and generated a strong gravitational pull that not even light can escape. So, attracting matter while simultaneously releasing energy, a black hole both undermines and supports the space around it. So the underwater organizations, in a way, Naples, work in a similar fashion. They create black holes in a city that challenge the dominant narrative of space as a site simply contested by the oppressor and the oppressed, or determined by the hegemonic power of the oppressor. Yeah. In parallel with the discourse on criminal organizations define the fundamentalism of land and sea, black holes refuse closure by simultaneously undermining and supporting the space around them. So I want to use criminal narratives as lenses to uncover, the disruptions generated by these black holes across the official configurations of urbanity, and functioning as disruptive forces into the inner workings of the state, as Chris Canine puts it. Criminal narratives reshape the meaning of evidence and provide alternative discourses. As criminalization is dependent on historical and political amnesia and on processes of barbering and racialization, criminology itself is closely intertwined with post-colonial discourse and a post-colonial perspective. And the way in which he argues this is that maybe criminology as such should take into consideration these other perspectives coming from both cultural and literary representations of criminality. So now I just want to discuss what I've talked about so far, that I've referred to, in reference to one specific text that I'm gonna analyze or just talk about in reference to some of the points that I discussed at the beginning of this talk. So, in this section, I reposition Naples on a post-colonial map of Italy through an exploration of the disjunctures generated by criminal organizations in the semi-fictional text, Il Libro Napoletano dei Morti, the Neapolitan Book of the Dead. I don't know if some of you have read it, but it was published in 2012 by Francesco Palmieri. And this text maps the evolutionary trajectory of the Camorra and its effects on the city, and demonstrates how criminality as a disruptive force opposing the fundamentalism of land and sea creates a number of black holes in the city, subverting traditional reconfigurations of urbanity. So Il Libro Napoletano dei Morti both dismantles and reiterates some of the cultural essentialisms or stereotypes associated with Naples. So, since Italian unification, written from the perspective of the Neapolitan poet and journalist Ferdinando Russo, the text narrates in the first person the story of the consolidation of the Camorra power in Naples after Italian unification in 1861. The emphasis on fictionalization, the attempt to reconstruct and reinvent an alternative history of the city, constitutes the cardinal point of the text. Starting in 1927 with a prolepsis that anticipates the death of the protagonist, Il Libro Napoletano dei Morti refocuses the narration to 1860, the year when Garibaldi entered the city, marking the end of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies and the beginning of the process of internal colonization. So the historical situateness is counterposed against the unreliability of the narrator, who informs the reader that despite not being born yet, he can tell the real story of the city from the privileged perspective of a distant observer. So this is the beginning of the text. So the poet says, "If I go to my balcony, I cannot see either the port nor Vesuvius. All I can see are the roofs of the block of flats. First floors are better because they do not distract you. I will tell the story of Purgatory Cafe that opened the door to the demise of the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. Epochal changes ushered in a new era when Naples used to be associated with the exotic south, an image that is cherished in all northerners' hearts, where lemons grow, Genesta flowers spread the perfume, olive trees beam, and where people like the devil." So, from the incipit, the first-person narrator announces that we will tell a different and alternative story of the city, which is not based on the classic icons that we can all identify and we can all associate with Naples, such as Vesuvius and the Bay of Naples. It actually says, I'm actually going to omit this narrative of the city, which is not going to be based on the images that most of us are familiar with. So, as two of the most popular landmarks of the city, the Wakana and the Bay, only conform to a static vision of the city, which does not offer any possibility of a personal knowledge of space. Rather, the narrator announces that the Bay are two elements that he's going to forget about. So Rousseau endeavors to dismantle the idea of an exotic South where people are like the devil, and states that this narrative is historically grounded in the demise of the Kingdom of the Sicilies. And he also tries to dismantle the stereotype of like this exotic South where people are like the devil, which refers back to a study by Croce, who was referring to a 16th century kind of way of stereotyping the inhabitants of Naples. Anyway, so the emphasis on writing and the imaginative process requires a tabula rasa conceptualization of the city that preempts traditional spatial reconfigurations. From a balcony where it is impossible to see any trace of human activity, writing becomes the generative medium for which individual and collective acts of redemption take place. The story of the city, like the protagonist himself who is about to die, is haunted by a sense of finitude that will ultimately lead to a cyclical end and rebirth. As the title itself suggests, the text is a re-evocation of forgotten memories as well as a list of ghosts. Rousseau himself states that the book he's going to write is a requiem, a mass for the dead, and the trope of death pertains to the act of restoring the memories of the city, but also to the process of resurrecting its defunct paths and alternative routes. Café Purgatorio, Purgatory Cafe, refers both to a specific location situated in the heart of the city and to the metaphorical significance of Rousseau's transitional narrative of Naples. So, the Camorra is the force that generates the writer's narrative. As he puts it, nobody ever told me to explore the hidden and sullied urban corners and side streets to understand the city I could have observed from a high balcony over Mare Chiaro. Indeed, I needed to tell the truth about the people of this city. And the appropriation of the language of the Camorra is a means to discover Naples and its people for the idiom of quotidian life. So paradoxically, criminality brings a democratization of representation that allows the poet to tell the truth. So this image is contrasted with two different points of observation as well, one from the highest and one from the most affluent area of the city, so Mare Chiaro, and the other one from the low and sullied corners of the side streets, which is Rousseau, which constitutes Rousseau's a favorite perspective. And the Camorra, emerging from Rousseau's story, is primarily an urban phenomenon, closely intertwined with events taking place at the national level. So, attentively treading the terrain of commonality and difference, Rousseau tries is careful to distinguish between also brigand soldiers who are faithful to the king and Camorristi loyal to the new Italian state. I repeat, I'm only reporting on Rousseau's narrative of the Camorra, so his own version of the Camorra. So mixing traditional historiography with folklore, Rousseau informs the reader that the Camorra at the dawn of the newly unified state facilitated the entrance of the Piedmontese government into Naples, acting as a police force against the brigands. So, however, once the annexation of the city was finalized, the Camorra began to penetrate gradually into the, quote, the meanders of the belly of Naples, end quote. So, initially appointed as guardians of the Italian state, criminal organizations progressively became an outlet for the unemployed, we call it sub-proletariat, of the central areas of Naples, creating a parallel network of support and identification. So the Camorra that Rousseau mentions in his narrative is located in the very center of Naples, in places such as Mezzocannone, Capodimonte, Piazza Municipio, all in the vicinity of the older Roman decumani, the free access that used to characterize the Roman, the topography of the Roman Neapolis. So the hierarchical structure of the early Camorra also translates into a chain of production that is also equally centralized. So the transition from one boss to the other is marked by the different degrees of control that criminals exert over the central areas of the city through activities that both support and supplant the official economy of the newly unified state. So this old Camorra is very much like a new business adopting the language of the disenfranchised sectors of the population and providing employment opportunities and protection. However, as the text demonstrates, despite preserving the paternalistic attitudes today, criminal syndicates morph into global corporations affecting the composition of external areas of the city. So as Rousseau explains, progressively embracing the, this is a quote, the vices of bourgeois wealth, end quote, the Camorra acts as a coeval force with the wider economy in the state. The real-life episode that in 1918 culminates with the accidental death of a Neapolitan academic, Vitale, caught in a shooting between the two members of the same clan, disputing over private business, represents the sanctioning of the links between the state and criminality, both of them in pursuit of the promises of capitalist accumulation. So, on a metaphorical level, the location of the incident is representative of the structural changes of criminal organizations. And as the narrator points out, the event itself did not take place in one of the forgotten corners of Naples, but actually in the famous shopping gallery Umberto I, which was actually built just after Italian unification as part of a renovating process of the city, which was undertaken by the Piedmontese government as well. So there's an obvious allusion to the connivance between the official and the unofficial economies, represented respectively by the interests of both the Italian state and the forces operating outside it. So to expose the intersection of both economies and their impact on the city, Rousseau draws on the metaphor of the siren Partenope, the mythical founder of Naples. According to ancient mythology, the city is built upon the corpse of the siren who committed suicide because of her unrequited love for Ulysses. However, rather than being represented as a romantic and tragic figure, Partenope is a devilish creature, half bird and half human. She's portrayed as an ambiguous feminine figure who both repels and attracts, and this is one of the, this is an image of the siren Partenope. So, I've got a quote from the Neapolitan Book of the Dead. So Naples, so talking about Partenope, Naples sometimes drinks its own blood, it sprinkles it on its streets and among its people. I'm thinking of the ambiguity of the siren represented as an attractive woman, whereas archaic images show that she's a devilish bird. The fountain in Spina Corona, dating back to the Middle Ages, portrays her with wings, spurting water from her breasts. Neapolitans have been fed by breasts. Yet if her milk feeds you, you're in danger of becoming demonic too. So here Russo describes the double connotation of the siren as a symbol of the city, which is neither completely polar to or synecdochic with the Camorra as well. So the siren's claws can stretch and kill any of her sounds. Russo connects this metaphor to the ambivalence of the spaces occupied by criminal organizations within the city, and with a further prolepsis situates the siren in the present by narrating the story of the death of another Neapolitan son, the journalist Giancarlo Siani. So constituted an abrupt caesura within the text, the final chapter, Night in 2011, is told through the perspective of a different narrator who reflects on Russo's work for the newspaper Il Mattino. And then there are several parallels between Russo and Giancarlo Siani, who was also working for Il Mattino and was actually killed in 1985 for exposing all the plots between some Camorra clans in Torre Annunziata and some politicians. So now, going back to my original point, yes, I'm going to finish in a second. To my original point, so if criminals cannot be categorized within conventional dichotomies of power between the oppressor and the resistor, it becomes difficult to investigate the effects of their underground activities on the public space of the city. And as you probably know, there are different theorizations and approaches to urban space and the way in which we can regard an urban space, also in relation to post-colonial and walled cities. And I'm thinking of Desertor, Baba, Lefebvre. They all mention in a way the space which is negotiated by the oppressor and the resistor, and the dialogue between these opposing forces generates an accommodational space where contradictions are temporarily solved. But this basically doesn't apply to the spaces generated by criminal organizations. So their ambiguous position parallels the siren's synecdochic relationship with the city, representing several oxymoronic signifiers as of beauty, beast, life and death, attraction and repulsion. The imaginative paradigm of the siren's charming appearance opens up to a series of interpretations that cannot be polarized into traditional dichotomies of power. As a Mediterranean creature, she also refuses to abide by the fundamentalism of London Sea. And both the stranger and the foreign lover, and the charming and universally appealing object of sexual desire, the siren also erases the boundaries between the familiar and the unfamiliar. And this predicament also applies to another dimension that Cassano mentions in Sandiford, which is the conviviality of Mediterranean thought, which is explained as, well, he explains it as in relation to the Mediterranean, the fact that the Mediterranean conjoins different lands and different cultures, where the other is never far away. So the other is never an alien figure or a totally like a known figure. So this applies to the siren, the ambiguity of these spaces created by criminal organizations as well. So the siren represents a double connotation of, so as a convivial and alien figure. So what I wanted to say basically was, so literary and cultural representations of underworld Naples can actually help us to uncover the black holes where both central and marginal discourses are rearticulated. So by positing Naples as a defining example for an alternative theorization of post-colonial and world cities through the lens of criminality. And I want to stop here now.